Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody here early on a Friday morning. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the Salt Lake Chamber's Professional Development Series. We are so glad that you're here with us today. This event is part of a series, and you will receive invitations to additional professional development events through the Salt Lake Chamber. We're really excited for today's session. William Nixon is Chairman and CEO of Policy Impact Communications, a Washington, D.C. based public relations and government affairs firm. Bill, we are thrilled to have you here today. Go ahead.
I always like to add, Derek Miller and Heidi call me the Chief Communications Officer at the Chamber as well. It's an honor to work with the Chamber and work as closely as I do. In fact, I was there yesterday. I'm now back in Washington, D.C., and things seem to be peaceful here, at least for the time being. But I do miss Salt Lake. We've got a home out there, and frankly, if it's up to me, I probably would spend much more time out there than I do back here. I see other people are still joining us, and I will give them just a few minutes while I maybe share some housekeeping with all of you and how we can make sure that this is most effective for folks. If you do have cameras, we would love to have you join us by camera, because there will be some things that you'll want to take a look at, as well as I want the interactivity. The great thing about Zoom is that we can all be together in kind of an intimate environment, but all coming from our own homes. There's not a lot of technology that allows us to do this, and I do want to make sure that your voices are heard and that you have an opportunity to stop, ask questions, share experiences you've had. In fact, we're going to start with a sharing of some experiences here in a minute. We have an awful lot of folks here. Generally, we're doing 4 of these in the series. We've done one on media training already, where we actually did on-camera work. And that was very effective. And I know a lot of you were there at that workshop. And if you weren't, I'm sure with Maria and Heidi and Marissa, we'll try to repeat it later in the year or early next year. This is going to be about preparing to give that inevitable speech, whether it's a 2-minute speech or to in an elevator or to an auditorium of 20,000 people. The principles are the same. We're going to take some time to go over those principles. But the first rule that I would love to have govern this is that we have fun. I want everybody to enjoy this. When learning is a fun process anyway, or we wouldn't be investing our time to do it. It's useful. And so I want you to laugh. I want you to share some of your experiences. I'll share some of my experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I want to get to know each other. I want to make sure that by the time we're done, you feel comfortable with me, comfortable enough to take the offer that if you need any just one-on-one tutorial, or if you would like me to look at something. I know I've already received a video from someone who's participating in this and had an opportunity to go through and tell that individual all the good things that he does and share a couple of things that I think he might want to focus on. But by way of your engagement here, we'll give you my contact information, and you're free to email me or text me if you have questions. But if you're called to speak impromptu and only have 2 minutes, don't call me in the 30 seconds. This is not kind of a call a friend kind of thing. I want you to focus on standing and delivering those 2 minutes rather than thinking, let me get Bill on the phone and then see what we can work out here. Again, I like the idea of this format. We can all be together even though we're not in the same room. How intimate and how much fun we have is really going to be up to you. And so again, I invite you to just raise your hand. I think I'm going to be able to see everybody at once, which again is really remarkable. And so if you raise your hand, or if you send Marissa a text, Marissa will contact me, and I'm happy to stop and address those issues. So ask questions at any time. Don't worry about taking notes. We will give you a manual workbook when this is over. I do it afterward because I've found that when you do it beforehand, your audience wants to read the book and listen while they're reading the book. And I'd rather have us interact and have an engaging time together. And so all of the material we cover will be covered both in the handout or in the manual that you'll receive. And it'll also be covered in my lecture notes, which I don't hate to call it a lecture, but in my notes. And you'll get both of those when this is over. And so all of the material we cover, you will have. So what I'd rather you do, if you want to take notes, is take notes about the impressions you have. Take notes about the things that you hear today that are going to be applicable to you. Don't worry about the ABCs of what we talk about, because all of that will be given to you, but you're going to have some insights as we get into what we call the flow, and we'll talk about that a little later. And that's the place we always want to be. That's the sweet spot when it comes to communication. We've always had, I think every one of us has had that experience where time and cares, concerns kind of slip away, and we just engage in a conversation, a discussion, a speech, a writing assignment, whatever it might be, even skiing or ice skating, when we're in that moment. And that's what we want to achieve here. That's what you ultimately want to achieve when we get into, when you speak. And there's a science to that. That's the wonderful thing about it. And we're going to talk about this in kind of scientific terms today. So just jot down the impressions you have. If you have questions and you're too shy, you know, only 20% of Americans say they're not shy. The rest of them are at some degree of shyness. We've got to get out of that a little bit, and we'll talk about how to do that. But if you are too shy to want to ask questions to the group, jot down in your notes what you want to talk to me later about. And that brings up kind of the format for today. We will take a full 2 hours to cover the course material. And then what I will do is stay an extra hour. So anybody who wants to get off at 2 hours can jump off at 2 hours knowing that we've covered all the course material. If any of you have questions that you didn't want to bring up, or you want to get into a little meatier discussion on some of the things we're going to discuss, particularly since some of this will be at the science level, and we're not going to be able to get so deep into it in 2 hours, we can dig in a little deeper later on. So if something strikes you, write it down, and let's have a give and take. And then again, at the end, I'll give you my contact information and welcome you to reach out. And if you have questions or even need help as you prepare for whatever kind of communication experience you have around the corner. I first want to begin, and it's always fun, and we'll go back to why it's important, to talk about disasters. And in communicating, we've all had disasters. I don't care if it's trying to express ourselves to someone we love. I don't care if it's trying to pitch a project idea. I don't care if it's speaking, again, in an auditorium to thousands. We've all had a disaster. And again, if you can come on by video, I'd love to have you come on by video so you can raise your hand and we can see your face and we can talk about this. But I'd like to open up by asking anybody if they'd like to share a disaster that they've had trying to speak or communicate. Come on, we're all here, we're all in this together. Besides, I'll tell you that the first rule of communication is there really is no disaster because everything becomes material. I'm obviously going to share with you a disaster I had, but let's start with Lloyd. Thank you, Lloyd.
Well, and I think I'm off mute. Do I get a sound check here? Am I coming through?
You're great.
Bill, you said to write down impressions. And the first impression I had is that I usually think of these things when I'm going to stand in front of a group of 100, 200, 300. But the impression I had was that I had a lunchtime meeting that was an opportunity of a one-on-one that I had been working for a period of time, and I blew it. I thought I've got a whole hour, and I think I kind of rambled through that whole hour. And the feedback of my colleague who had put the meeting together is, I missed the first 30 seconds to give the crisp, succinct introduction of, why I wanted the meeting and what I wanted to accomplish in the meeting, and my quick introduction of me. And so I made the mistake of thinking I had, 60 minutes to casually get through. And the criticism was that I blew it in the first 30, 40 seconds.
And now, did you have that feeling in the first 30 or 40 seconds, Lloyd?
Oh, I don't think I even caught it.
Why is that later on?
I found it out later on that,
Okay.
that I just had not made the initial powerful connection that I should have made. And there is I think, and you'll teach us here, but there is a way to make the soft connection and then move on to the real agenda. But I think I spent the whole hour and never really got my agenda across.
Sometimes a short speech, a short presentation is the most difficult thing in the world to give because you're on time constraints. Sometimes a long presentation is the most difficult thing in the world to give because there's so much time to fill and you're trying to understand, okay, what are my key points? What do I want to leave behind with the audience? And you can meander because you think, well, I've got all the time, and eventually truth and light will come out. We just don't know if they're going to be able to capture the truth and light when it comes out, or if by that time they've shut off.
Yep.
A lot of this really begins with the audience. But thank you for sharing that. And we're going to come back to a couple of points on that, Lloyd, that I think you'll see are very similar to some of the other experiences other people have had. Anybody else want to share one of their communication disasters? Anyone? No? I mean, this is fine. Remember, we're talking about an elevator pitch. We're talking about a conversation with a dear friend, and we're talking about a presentation to 30,000 people in a special event center.
Hi, Bill. I'll jump in and give you one.
Thank you.
This is Jim Porter from the World Trade Center, Utah. I was recently pitching a project charter to a boss and a colleague, or we had been talking about this project for some time, and it was my job to drop the charter and kind of define the project for them and what our next steps would be. And I made the mistake of starting to talk about the project in terms of why I had developed the project charter and what some of the intricacies are in it, assuming that they already understood everything that was in there. And we probably spent the next 10 minutes just trying to reorient ourselves to the question of the project charter because I decided to start from the wrong angle, and it kind of wasted some meeting time and caused us to do some resetting on the project that I would have preferred not to do.
Isn't that absolutely one of those things when you go in and you don't have bedrock on your founding principle, and so the whole presentation gets redirected to trying to address that founding principle. I will talk a little bit about that. Much of this comes down to audience. Obviously, a lot of it comes down to preparation, and then actually the structure of the presentation itself, amount of time we have, and we'll address that as we go through here today. And no guarantee that we won't have disasters in the future. I'll share one with you that I had, and this is after a lifetime in communications. I mean, I have written for presidents. I've done media training for presidents and senators and billionaires throughout the world, and I've done debate, negotiation training, and you would think I would know better, but I had an unmitigated disaster 4 years ago, exactly 4 years ago, that I'll share with you in just a minute. Anybody else, though, before I go? Go on, someone's thinking, gee, I want to tell about that time that, No? You're also excited to hear my disaster, aren't you? Anybody know what quicksand is? Have you ever heard that term in athletics or art, performance, creative endeavors, when you get caught in quicksand? Anybody? Have you ever seen a football team actually implode on the field right before your eyes? They were doing so well in the first half, maybe into the third quarter, and then all of a sudden things began to devolve, and frankly, the harder they tried, the worse things became. I call that quicksand. The faster you, the more you struggle, the faster you sink. That happens in public speaking. And that happened to me 4 years ago there in Utah. I've been asked for 4 years in a row to come out and give a Washington briefing at the Montage to a group of about 300 executives. It was 8 o'clock in the morning breakfast speech, and the executives, and I mean no offense by this, but the executives were accountants. And so I thought, how do I prepare for this? I mean, obviously, accountants are extremely analytical people. You know, it's going to be 8 o'clock in the morning. They're going to they had the big entertainment the night before that went past midnight. I'm sure they had been substantial socializing and imbibing and doing the things that you do on wonderful nights when you're wrapping up and going into the last day of a very successful seminar. And there was a lot going on in Washington at the time, and I thought, well, you know, I'm going to actually write the speech. Now, generally, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, there's a balance between whether you write and prepare a formal speech or you go with notes off the cuff. Interestingly enough, some of the great, most memorable speeches that we have heard, you know, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth a nation. We'll fight them on the landing fields, we'll fight them on the fields, we'll fight them in the sea, we'll fight them in the, you know, these are all written speeches. That's why they become memorable. They're poetry, frankly. And I guess I was a bit intimidated, but had also a very healthy respect for the fact there'd be 300 accountants, you know, professionals at the top of their careers at the Montage in the ballroom. I wrote one of the most beautiful speeches I've ever written. I mean, it covered everything, and there was poetry in there, and there was moving verse, and it had everything that I thought a wonderful speech should have. And I stood up and I thought I'd start with a joke. And again, no offense to accountants, but these are accountants at 8 o'clock in the morning. And nobody was ready for any humor at all. And we'll talk a little bit about humor and the appropriate use of humor and how to write humor and how to keep humor original and how we connect with the audience a little later on in this presentation today. But the folks were not ready for humor. I mean, they were just waking up. I think they were ready for some strong caffeinated drink and some protein with eggs to overcome the night. So needless to say, my humor bombed. At that point, I thought, uh-oh, and I reached for my lifeline. And that was going to be the speech. Now, I thought I had rehearsed the speech enough that I could talk spontaneously, kind of keeping eye contact. But the minute they saw me begin to read the speech, I literally saw a wall come up between me and the audience. I mean, suddenly their heads went down, utensils were clanking against china. So what did I do? I probably should have stopped, redirected. We'll talk about some of the things we can do to save ourselves, but instead I doubled down. I just started to read faster and faster, struggling more and more to get out of that quicksand, and I just continued to feel myself sink. And as I felt myself sink, I started to perspire. I couldn't wait to get off the stand. I kept looking out thinking, come on, somebody throw me a lifeline. At one point I stopped, and here's where it was just went from unmitigated disaster to unspeakable. I said, does anybody here have any questions? And there was this dead silence, and I think somebody finally thought, well, let's throw him a lifeline. And he said, we were right in the middle of the primary election for the Republican candidates, Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and Donald Trump, and so that had not been decided. And someone said, yeah, I have a question. Who do you think's going to get the nomination? And of course, I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm expected to have these kinds of opinions anyway. I may not have the answer, but I should have the opinion. And I said, I think a really remarkable ticket would be Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. And all of a sudden, this arm goes up in the back, and I said, yes, thinking I'm going to get another question. And he said, oh, I just want you to know it's against the law for Jeb and Marco to run on the same ticket. Two people can't come from the same state. So now all of a sudden, my position as an authority trying to connect with this audience is out the window. What else could this guy tell us that is going to be equally incorrect? Now, to this day, I don't know that that's really the law. I am sure that with McCain being born abroad and all of the exceptions that have been made, if the Republicans had figured out that would have been the best ticket. But instead, again, in the state I was in, this really was the final nail in the coffin. And I share this with you because it was just 4 years ago. I mean, this was something that I should have known better. I should have done better preparation work. I've given dozens, if not, maybe hundreds of speeches since. I speak all the time. But that day, I could not wait fast enough to get on the montage. In fact, I have a home. My home is in Midway, and sometimes I go to Park City up through Guardsman's Pass, and I don't do that anymore because I get this sick feeling in my stomach when I pass the montage, because that was such an experience. I've never been invited back. And so what we're going to do here today is talk about what I should have done rather than what I did do, and how no matter what we do or think, we've got to always make sure that we don't fall too much in love with any aspect. I mean, I actually, when it was over, was sharing it with my father, and my father said, well, let me read the speech. And so I sent it to my father, and he wrote back with such superlatives. I think the kindest thing he's ever said to me in my life about how wonderful that speech was and how it's exactly what people needed to hear. And again, it was wonderful to be read, but it was horrible. It should never have been delivered. I would have been better just to mail it out to them. That brings up a point. If 20% of us claim not to be shy, the rest of 80% of us are a little bit shy. We've actually heard the statistic that the majority of people would rather face death than public speaking. I won't ask for a show of hands, but do you feel that way? I remember back in the days of Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry Seinfeld made that point and said, you know what this means? This means if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. And I think there's some of us who do feel that way. Public speaking can actually be paralyzing. Communicating at any level can actually be paralyzing. And today we're going to examine why. And we begin actually from the perspective that this is not a new phenomenon. It's not a new question. People have been asking this since the beginning of recorded history. If you go and you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which was the oral tradition of Homer that was then finally printed hundreds of years later, you'll see a great deal of time given to speaking. It was so important. And you'll actually look at the characteristics, the qualities that even back in those days, the ancient Greeks felt were necessary. And this was before it was formalized. There was a time actually before Aristotle that speaking was perceived to be such an art that only certain individuals were endowed with the gift of speaking. And this, of course, is what Homer was dealing with when he wrote about Menelaus and in Ulysses and talked about the qualities that they brought and what made them powerful speakers. It was not until Aristotle that he began to look at communication at a scientific level, and we began to discover that it's really not an innate gift. Any one of us can be effective public speakers. Any one of us can be effective communicators, particularly on an intimate level with those we love or care about. Any one of us can give a very effective pitch if that's required. I'm going to stop here and just ask any questions thus far on what we've talked about. Anybody else want to share your disaster that we can then use as a object lesson as we get further and further into the meat here this morning? No one's been impressed to do that? Okay, then we'll move on. I actually want to begin by reading you a passage from the Iliad, book 3 by Homer. This is a translation done by Alexander Pope, so it's a beautiful poetic passage, but I want to set the stage with this. So please listen carefully. All these will be in your notes, so you don't have to write anything down, but listen to how Homer compares and contrasts the ability of Artemis' son, Menelaus, to Ulysses, or Atreus' son, Menelaus. When Atreus' son harangued the listening train, just was his sense and his expression plain, his words succinct, yet full, without fault. He spoke no more than just the thing he ought. But when Ulysses rose, in thought profound, his modest eyes he fixed upon the ground. As one unskilled or dumb he seemed to stand, nor raised his head, nor stretched his sceptered hand. But when he speaks, what elocution flows, soft as the fleeces of the descending snows. The copious accents fall with easy art, melting they fall and sink into the heart. Wondering we hear and fixed in deep surprise, our ears refute the censor of our eyes. Did I read that in a way that you were able to envision the scene that's going on here? They're ready to go to war. They're rallying their troops. Menelaus speaks first. What does he do according to Homer? Anybody want to comment on that? What were the qualities of Menelaus? Come on, guys. We're in this together today. I want to hear from one of you. This is about communication. No? Let me read Menelaus one more time. Lloyd, you were going to say something. I caught you there.
I'd like to hear you read it one more time and make sure I'm not mixing the two up, but I think, Bill, that he is eloquent and succinct and inspiring, but yet does he get shown up by the one who is more sincere and more genuine?
Great points. Absolutely. Here are the qualities of Menelaus. Just was his sense. So he was analytical. He was talking logically. His expression plain. So he wasn't full of air, he wasn't showing off airs. He wasn't using words that I call them dollar words when nickel words will do. His words were succinct, but they were full. So he wasn't using superfluous language. He was speaking succinctly. In fact, Homer says he was without fault. He spoke no more than just the thing he ought. So from our perspective, Menelaus did everything that we're going to talk about here, and we'll go deeper into each of those qualities. But then Ulysses rises. And what does Ulysses do? I mean, he does not have, obviously, the charisma that Menelaus does. When Ulysses rose in thought profound, his modest eyes he fixed upon the ground. As one unskilled or dumb he seemed to stand, nor raised his head, nor stretched his sceptered hand. Now Ulysses, the leader, he could have commanded what he was going to say, and people would have thought if he'd raised that sceptered hand, and people would have had to be obedient to whatever Ulysses had to tell them. But when he speaks, what elocution flows, soft as the fleeces of descending snows. The copious accents fall with easy art, melting they fall and sink into the heart. Wondering we hear, and fixed in deep surprise, our ears refute the censor of our eyes. So when we juxtapose Menelaus and Ulysses, what do we learn here? We learn the qualities that are necessary for a good speech, which Menelaus has, but Ulysses had something a little extra that was so profoundly important to Homer. Anybody want to venture that?
Heart.
I think we talked about it. Julia?
It's the heart. Yep.
Yeah. Ulysses was speaking to the heart. And this is what Aristotle tells us. When we speak, there are two things we're speaking to. We're speaking to the head, and we're speaking to the heart. Now, the head's not going to listen if the heart's not engaged. That's a great line from Jerry Maguire, if any of you remember that old movie. People don't care what you know till they know that you care. And if in fact, what does Dickie Fox, the great Dickie Fox, say? If this ain't working, this ain't working. And there's a lot of truth to that. It takes 7 seconds for people to size you up. Now, that used to be before social media. There's a vast possibility, and maybe some of you did it today. You went on, okay, do I sign up? Do I want to spend 2 hours with this guy and have him talk to me about communications? Let me go on and find out a little about him. So impressions get formed the minute anybody begins to talk about a communication engagement. But the minute you enter in to give a speech in a place like the Montage, you've got 7 seconds to present yourself. People are already deciding, is this going to be worth listening to? Now, Ulysses had that. What do we call it in our day and age of marketing? Anybody in marketing, what do we call what Ulysses had? We call it Ulysses. Come on. Kim Kardashian has it. Steve Jobs had it. We call it their brand. Ulysses had a brand, and Ulysses was true to his brand. So we begin with considering the scientific approach we're going to discuss in Aristotle and bringing that genuinely together with our brand. And that's where the magic is going to be made. So as we talk about these things, I want you to consider, who am I? What do I stand for? Because I'll tell you what, the one thing nobody will abide is hypocrisy. Nobody will abide you coming in, or anybody coming in and representing something that they're not. They'll smoke you out so fast if that head and heart don't match up. So as we go through now what are my 9 rules of public speaking, I want you to consider these rules in terms of who you are. And there'll actually be one that deals more specifically with the brand, and we'll talk about your brand, because some of you may have never thought about this before. Who am I? What do I represent? What do I stand for? What do people think of when they think of me? Do they think I'm a good mother, a dear friend, a loyal employee? Do they think I'm exceptionally analytical? Do they think that I've got good emotional IQ? Do they think that I'm spiritual? Do they think that I have a value set that they can depend on when they need some information? Do they think I'm an idea person? What is your brand? And that even comes down to, what do you wear? It's no mistake that Steve Jobs had the mock black turtleneck and the Levi's. That was his brand. One of my clients is the wealthiest man in Asia. His name was Li Kai-shing. Jack Ma now with Alibaba is the wealthiest, but Li Kai-shing for for a quarter century, was the wealthiest man in Asia, all of Asia. I think Forbes today has his net worth at about $33 billion. But Li Ka-shing has 2 suits that hang in his closet, both of them blue. He's got a handful of white shirts. He's got just a pair of plain looking black shoes. I'm going to show you something I keep right here. This is, every time I go see Li Ka-shing, he gives me a watch. He loves watches. And he always, I put in my safe deposit box because I'm afraid to wear them, to be honest, because they're Audemars Piguets and I mean, I don't even know, I'm not really a watch guy. But this is the most cherished watch that he gave me. Why? Because it's a replica of the watch he wears, which is a $26 Seiko. So he will have no thought about giving away an $18,000 watch to somebody. In fact, he gave my wife once the America's Cup Audemars Piguet collectors with all the diamonds. We really didn't even know what it was until we saw the movie Blindside. And Sandra Bullock was wearing it throughout Blindside, and we thought we better check into that watch, and we found out. But this is a $26 Seiko. This is the watch that Li Ka-shing wears. That's his brand. Everybody who knows Li Ka-shing knows that he's a humble man. Simple Conchi in the morning. He's given away 1/3 of his wealth. He's very devout Buddhist. Built the most beautiful Buddhist monastery up in the mountains above the clouds in Hong Kong. A remarkable man, and that's his brand. People trust him. In fact, over in Hong Kong, they call him Superman because of his ability to be able to read the markets and do business. But he'll never surprise you. He wears these big, thick glasses. Wonderful man. Anyway, so what is your brand? And I'm not suggesting you change it. It's got to authentically portray who you are. And then you bring that brand in to a dynamic that we're going to begin talking about now. And we're going to go into these rules that will allow you to scientifically create this foundation that's going to help you become an extremely effective communicator. The first rule is to know your audience. Everything is going to begin with an audience. And I don't care if we're talking about 30,000 people in the special events center. I don't care if we're talking about 6 people in a boardroom or an individual that you're trying to share your intimate feelings with. The audience is always an audience, and you have to kind of see it as that, not to the extent that you bring formality into the relationship, but that you communicate from their perspective. It's really not important. It's really not important what you say as much as it is what they hear. And so there's got to be this two-way communication. There's a Wesley McLean model of communication. This was the first to really explore this idea. It used to be back in the old days, there were these stentorian speeches and, you know, we are gathered here today, and the place echoes, and that's how people were known to be great orators. It's not the way it is anymore. In fact, if you go back and you look at some of the great speeches given in history, like Pericles' funeral oration or the Gettysburg Address, they were actually, while they were well prepared, they were actually more intimate in nature. But they come from the perspective of who is the audience, what does the audience want to hear? And I tell clients who listen that there's a difference between a room full of kindergartners and a joint session of Congress. There's not much of a difference, but there's a difference. And so every audience is nuanced. And the better prepared you are for the nuances of that audience, the better, more comfortable you're going to be in your presentation. The rules that will guarantee the success in both of those audiences are the same. They're going to be modified to suit the audience, but they're going to be the same. And how you follow those rules will need to change every time you speak. The great philosopher Heraclitus said that you can't bathe in the same river twice. He said the mixture which isn't shaken decomposes and the river moves forward. It's the same thing with communication. You can basically, from your perspective, think that you're saying the same thing to your lover or best friend that you said a week ago, and it went over so well, but today they take offense. Well, their mood. What did they have for breakfast? What did you have for breakfast? What happened last night? What was the conversation just 20 minutes before? So you have to go in and you modify for that audience. Shakespeare understood this well in Love's Labor Lost when he said, the jest prosperity lieth not in the gesture, but in the hearer of the jest. In other words, whether you succeed or fail as a failure has less to do, frankly, with actually the words, but how you convey, using the heart and the head, how you convey that the message that you want to share back with your audience. So there are a couple of things we want to consider when we go into an audience. Anybody want to venture to guess what you think some of the important things we want to take note of? Okay, I'm going to start doing one of these things where I say, Julie Warnock.
I mean, like you said, just take note of where they're at. Jump into their shoes to see from their point of view, so your message will resonate with them, and you don't have that wall like you said in that room of accountants. You know, you didn't maybe address them from the fact of how they felt and who they were as a person.
I'll be honest with you, I didn't consider it. You're exactly right, Julie. I didn't even consider that they were accountants. I considered only from my perspective as I wrote that speech. If I wanted to hear someone give me a report from Washington, what would I want to hear? And I didn't think that these folks had maybe a completely different interest. That's exactly right. Anybody else? Yes.
Can I give you an example? So I work at Clyde Companies, which is a parent company of a bunch of construction companies, and I was asked to give a group of trainings on communication, trust, workplace. It was a DDI course. Anyway, so I'm trying to teach these construction managers, workers, supervisors about how to build trust, and one of the ways you build trust is through vulnerability, through empathy, and I'm trying to teach them, you know what I mean, that you've got to care, and all of them are like big and gruff and like why would this doesn't work to me? My people, if I started empathizing with my workers and laborers, they're gonna laugh me, here and back and stuff. And so it's like you have to start out from how they feel, listen to them, and then kind of find that resonating point. That empathy is a human emotion that everyone needs. I don't care how tough you are, it's just gonna maybe look different, or how you communicate it or translate it will be different, but you still need it. And so if I came into the room not willing to relate to them or kind of get to their level or use some of their talk, then I would have not even had any success whatsoever.
Yep, no, that's exactly right. Anybody else want to? Yes, Julia.
Yes, I think you'd want to consider the context of what the person said before you, who was on stage or who introduced you. I think maybe you want to kind of lead with that same feel or on that same note, so it doesn't feel like a harsh contrast, but that you can keep in sync with the mood of the room.
Very good. That's very important, to explore who else is there with you. Sometimes, if you go back to what Julie was saying, sometimes it may be a good cop, bad cop. Julie, you got to come in, you got to come down. I get to go in and bring them up. We've got to get them balanced out as a group of workers. Anyone else? Anything else to share in terms of what you want to note about your audience? Fortunately, again, looking at this scientifically, there are certain qualities, certain audiences, certain assumptions we can make. Now, you know what an assumption is and what it does to both you and me. But there are thoughtful analysis that we can bring to understand. I should have known that with the accountants, I was really going into a bunch of analytical thinkers who frankly probably just wanted a discussion from their perspective on the polling data, on the issues that were coming up, and the likelihood, percentage likelihood even, of those being passed by Congress that year. Media manipulation maybe on some of the issues that I could bring concrete evidence on. But they were analytical thinkers, accountants, attorneys, engineers. And then you might have an audience that, now again, they're going to be among those accountants, people who are not just analytical, but they have other qualities. We're all very complex. That's why in Myers-Briggs and some of these tests, you have multiple elements within a personality, but you could have generally begun with the fact that, okay, this is an analytical group. You know, the second would be sensitive perceivers. These would be your counselors, your educators, your nonprofits, people who are going to be a little more given to emotion. You'd address them in a completely different way. You'd emphasize different aspects of your message with them than you would with an analytical group. Then you have your drivers and your dominators, your CEOs, your stockbrokers, your military leaders. Some of you, a couple of those early experiences that were shared when Lloyd's experience, I don't know who he was talking to, but I bet it probably would not have gone as badly as maybe Lloyd's companion suggested if the audience had been a little more social, a little more emotional, and less perhaps, Lloyd, I would say these are probably decision makers. And so the thought was, let's get in, let's give the message, and let's get out. And that's your drivers and your dominators. Then you have your inspirational and your expressive audience. If you go in and you give a speech to a group of ministers or in a church or social justice advocates, these are people who, again, that the heart may matter a little more to them than the head. And so you want to prepare your remarks more from the heart. And we're going to talk about how you prepare and you blend these two, the analytical with the pathos, with the feeling, the touchy. And finally, you have socializers. Your socializers are your salespeople. These are your public relations people. These are your marketing people. They want to know, okay, how do we influence? How do we get out? How do we broaden our brand? How do we build our influence? And they're going to look to you to see your ability to do that so they can then in turn apply it to their own objective or their own agendas. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts about any of that? You know, I should start calling on some of these folks who we don't have their videos, and then they'll want to be on video, like Lynn Evans. Lynn, are you out there? Any thoughts? Okay, I guess not. Please, if you want to come in, just come on in. So the last thing we want to consider in the audience is whether it's a voluntary audience or it's a command audience. That was another element I probably failed to share with you. The accountants that day were doing continuing education. So chances are most of them didn't even want to be there. They certainly didn't want to come hear me. They were there to get continuing education credits. That happens a lot of times at work. People are brought into a room and they're made to sit there and listen to you. They don't want to be there. They already have a chip on the shoulder. They're already got that bit of cynicism that show me, prove it, you better win me over. And that requires a different approach than a group that has actually come voluntarily because they want to learn something. And that brings us to the next rule, and that is to know your objective. After know your audience, what is your objective with that audience? And again, how do you fold that objective into what we talked about a moment ago about brand? There are 3 reasons why you're going to be in front of that audience, and there are only 3 reasons. But sometimes when we sit and we prepare our remarks, we don't really think about this. But an audience either comes to be instructed, they want to learn something, they trust you know something that's going to be valuable to them, they want to be entertained, They are going to a comedy club, or they understand you've a great raconteur with great anecdotes about a life well lived and however you've lived that life, and they want you to come make them laugh and make them feel and make them cry. And then there are those who have come to hear what you have to say in terms of being persuasive. Why should I vote for this? Why should I take this action? Why should I invest in this cause? Do they want you to explore new ideas with them? Do they want you to enlighten them about a decision they may have to make, a stock they want to invest in or may want to invest in after they listen to you? You have to understand who you are in relation to that objective. So when you come in, are you an expert? Have you had a 20% return on stocks for the last 2 decades, and they want to hear you persuade them about why they should invest the way you want them to invest? Are you the boss and you're pulling them all together in order to talk about the new objectives for 2021? You speak as an expert, or you speak as one having authority when you're in those kinds of situations? Or are you a witness? Are you somebody who has a unique perspective or something to share relative to whatever the subject is that day? I would have done much better at the montage that morning had I stood up and said, hey, just got off the plane from Washington. We got a lot going on, but I know you probably have things you want to hear. So why don't we ask you what's on your mind? And I would have spoken off the cuff. I was an expert witness. I'm from Washington. I spend day in, day out working around the environment and on issues and policies that are important to these people. They would have asked me, and I would never have been wrong, simply because I'm not pretending to be somebody I'm not. I'm staying well safely within my brand. So don't ever, if somebody says, gee, I would like to know how you feel about the current election, don't ever feel, well, I'm really not into politics, because you are you, and you are an expert in how you feel, and that's what they want to know. You can be humble and preface it and say, well, you know, I really don't follow politics all that much, but frankly, here are a couple of things that really do concern me about what I'm hearing. People walk away enlightened. They've gotten exactly what they asked you for. So don't ever hesitate to share what it is you have to share. How does your grasp and relationship with the subject compare to that of the audience? That's one of the things that you want to be careful about. You never want to go in and tell folks something that they know and that they doubt you know as well as they know. In other words, I would never have gone in to talk to that group of accountants about accountancy, because I know very little about accountancy and there's nothing I could contribute. Now, if they ask me to be a witness on how I feel about accountants, I could say, never speak to them at 8 o'clock in the morning after they've been up all night. And they would have laughed and taken away that, okay, that's a good insight from Bill Nixon on something maybe he knows about, but he certainly doesn't know anything about accountancy. So that's rule number 2, is to know your objective, know that in the context of your brand and what your audience wants to be focused on when you go to speak to them. Rule number 3, know the basic structure of the speech. And this is what Aristotle offered to us when he began to bring all of it together in a scientific way. He called it taxis. And that's the structure of an overall speech, T-A-X-I-S. And the speech has 3 parts. It's always interesting, threes, and we'll talk about the 3 rule of threes in a minute here, but the speech has 3 parts. The first part is the proem, or the beginning. What's important about the beginning? Let me open that up and ask some of you to share. When you stand up to speak, what do you think are the most important things that you ought to be doing, ought to be thinking about, ought to be prepared for? Come on.
Well, hey, so this is
Sarah.
Hey, yes. So I would say just obviously they're sizing you up and how you look, right? So that's 7 seconds.
Yep.
And then making some connection. And then I know in the work that I do, I often want the talks I give, I have to get them talking. So for me, in the first part, it's to actually get them responding to me in some way such that I set the stage that they will respond. So getting them responding, because that's a goal of the talk. So those would be ideas for me.
What invariably happens, Sarah, when you go in and you try to create that engagement, you try to respond, what happens? Have you ever noticed when you, I mean, obviously I'm going to give you the key to this, it's eye contact. So while they're sizing you up in those 7 seconds, you can be doing the same thing. You're going to be making eye contact. Now, what happens when you're trying to make eye contact with your audience, even before you stand to speak, Sarah? When you're trying to create that engagement, that unspoken engagement at the very beginning. Have you ever noticed?
Well, I think there's just that moment where you don't know if it's going to happen or not. I don't know. There's sort of like pregnant pause. There's a pregnant pause.
Spot on. You go in, you're sitting up there, you're thinking, you know what, I'm really not an ogre, I better smile. And you put on the smile and you try to keep that eye contact with them. And some of them invariably look away. 80% of us are shy. They don't want to be singled out. They really don't want to be, they don't have the confidence to return that eye contact and smile. So what do we do at that point? Oh, I better look away. I'm making that person uneasy. So then we look to somebody who may smile back, may hold contact with us. Now that's important, because before you stand to deliver, you can get a sense of those out in the audience that you can continue to return to for eye contact. And if they keep your eye contact, nothing emboldens you better. Nothing gives you an emotional sustaining foundation than having people look you in the eye, have that nice smile and nod back at you. But if you're looking at the wrong people, if you're looking at the people who looked away and you keep going back to them, they're still looking away, or worse yet, they're clinking utensils against china and focusing on their sausage, then you get in that quicksand. Suddenly you start to struggle. How do I get that person's attention? Well, 4 tables over, there may be somebody who's really into this speech that I can have a connection with and everybody else can listen into. The conversation you have with an audience is just like the conversation you have with an individual. That's what's beautiful about it. Well, only 20% of us may not be shy. We're a nation of voyeurs. You know that. We love People magazine. When I started out as a journalist, as a young man, that's where I started as a journalist before I went to Washington as a speechwriter for President Reagan. I had an opportunity of spending 3 days with Joan Rivers, who was at the height of her career. It was fascinating. And I wrote a cover story for a magazine called This Rivers Runs Wild. And Joan was the one who told me that the first time. She said, we're a nation of voyeurs. She said, I get all of my material out of People magazine and National Enquirer. And she says, and those are the 2 most popular magazines in the world, because everybody wants to know how that person is living. Well, it's the same thing when we're in an audience. If you establish that connection with just 1 person or 2 people or 3 people, everyone else is going to start listening in. They may not want to be the object of your attention, but they're going to start listening in. So as they're sizing you up, you get a sense of who they are too. And pick out the most gentle person in the room. We had an experience with a client who, brilliant medical doctor, who has done incredible work in mind management and how to think about things that you want to be thinking about when you're not thinking, to the extent where you can actually change behavior. And he had a presentation, and we needed to hear the presentation as a communications team to do his marketing. And he came in to make his presentation, and I had on my staff this was 10 years ago. He's since retired, but I had an older gentleman who had spent a lifetime as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and was kind of this grizzled, cynical, never smiled curmudgeon. I mean, curmudgeon. It was hard for me even to work with him, and I was the boss. But he was a nice guy. In fact, what I felt is that he actually had the most tender heart of everybody on staff, and that's why he was a curmudgeon. He had built this redoubt, this fortress around his emotions. And so this wonderful doctor comes in and he starts into his presentation in our boardroom, and it's a beautiful presentation. But then he just starts eroding. He gets into that quicksand. And after the presentation was over, and this doctor was just devastated that here he's supposed to be showing us about this program he has, that we're then going to help him sell or brand with the federal government. We've represented Franklin Covey in DC. We've done millions and millions and millions of dollars of helping people get in to the federal marketplace. And that's what he was there to do. And he and I went out to lunch. And he said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I cannot believe this happened to me." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "I focused too much on John." And immediately I understood. He didn't pick out the allies in the room that were going to lift him up and buoy his spirit and have him think and get creative and say things that he didn't even know he was going to come to say. That's where inspiration happens. That's the magic of communicating. When you find yourself saying things you had no anticipation you were going to say. But if you go in and you focus on that curmudgeon, I'll tell you what, it's over before it begins. Any thoughts on that? I see some smiles. I have a feeling there's some folks who have some things they want to share. So I'm going to shut up for about 10 seconds here and see if anybody wants to share something. An experience like this they may have had. I just get this vibe. Yes, Julia.
Yeah. So I may have buried it a little further in my subconscious, but I just remembered some of my failures with speaking through this discussion. And I'm thinking back to job interviews, actually. You know, usually the first interview you meet with one person, and if it goes well, they bring you back and you meet with 3 or 4 people. And that's where I found that I really struggle is I think that I can read one person well enough and try to make a connection. But when there's 3 or 4 different personalities in the room, I find myself kind of volleying back and forth between the person who seems the most warm, perhaps. And then, so I feel like I sometimes focus too much on maybe that person actually, and at the sake of ignoring the rest in the room, and then focusing on that one person who's quiet and taking too many notes, and it throws me off. So how do you strike a balance actually with that sometimes, especially if it's in a group that you need to appeal to everybody, because all 4 of those people would be making the decision if I were the one to hire or not.
What I would do is on the salient points that I want to make, when I'm in the proactive position, I would focus on the friend in the audience.
Okay.
I'd focus on the person because they're going to give you that gentle nod of, "You're doing great, Julia. Keep going." On the reactive, then you focus on the others in the room and just make sure that you're responding to them.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So
It does,
stay
yeah.
in control. What you want to do is manage your emotional, your psychic, your physical presence. And you want to do that with the allies in the room who you know are supporting just by their body language. And the body language goes both ways. We'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about the body language of the speaker, but what's the body language of the audience? And by watching that body language, whether it's 2 people, you know, the first thing you always want to watch are the eyes. If you lose eye contact, begin redirecting what it is you want to say. That's the first thing people say. Yes, Orrin. You're on mute.
Yes.
There we go.
Right, Ern Bodvarson. I'm the Dean of the Business School at Westminster College. So speaking of eyes, I have an experience also in regards to a job interview that killed the interview for me. And it was a situation where I was interviewing for a high-level position, and I had the entire search committee in front of me. And this is typically at administrative levels how these interviews go. They bring you to campus, and then you sit with a wide variety of people. And I was responding to a kind of potentially controversial question, which was about what is my stand on diversity? And that's a very common thing that administrators will be asked at universities and colleges is, what's your position on adversity? And it was a subject that I felt a little insecure about. And when I was responding to the question, which was not very well, I saw one of the search committee members shoot a look at another search committee member, which I took to mean, oh, this guy is falling apart. And it just killed my confidence. So it's also watching how members of your audience are reacting to one another when you're in a situation like that. That was a lesson learned.
Did you feel you were able to recover from that?
I asked, well, part of the problem I had was I didn't understand the question very well. So I did ask the individual to repeat the question, and I probably responded the second time around a little better to it, but I realized at the bottom of it was that I simply wasn't secure on the subject. And no matter how well you try to respond, if you don't have the basic content mastered and the confidence, you're just simply not going to perform well. And so I realized I need to go back and think about diversity more, and I need to anticipate questions better and feel confident and respond confidently. But it was just that bizarre interaction between those people in the search committee. It was like poison, honestly.
No, I get it. Sometimes you come out of an experience like that, Ern, and you think, I wonder what would have happened had I not caught that glance.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Again, had I maybe been focusing on my ally, the person in the room that was upbeat, or the person was, sometimes you can't help it. You've got to be quick to observe. I mean, that's critical on any engagement, because you can learn from those who aren't listening as well. But we are, I don't care if you call it spiritual, magical, ethereal, we are creatures that have so many complexities when it comes to our emotions and the way our emotions affect our analytics, our judgment, our ability to share. I mean, this is really why, when you think about it, dear friends are dear friends, because they know you so well. You can be so honest with them that you're not self-conscious. You can just speak from the heart. You can have that catharsis that's needed between the two of you, or the three of you, or the four of you in your group. Well, the more quickly you can get to that with an audience, the better off you're going to be. And you will find people who are allies in the audience. And that begins the moment you come in, but it also begins with that introduction, as was shared a few minutes ago. When you stand up and you deliver, who's looking at you, who's responsive, who's sustaining, how are you going to connect with that audience? And there are a couple of ways to do it. In the beginning, the connection can most effectively come through humor, unless it's a room full of accountants at 8 o'clock in the morning after spending a night out. Be careful. But humor can be safely done. It can be wisely done. We'll talk a little bit about the elements of humor. I had a opportunity, again, as a journalist, to interview Don Rickles back. Don was one of the great comedians. And Don Rickles had this kind of humor where he would tear people down and come to their audience. I mean, he would actually embarrass people in the audience. Now, they loved it. That's why they kept coming to his shows. But I remember in our interview, he said, Milton Berle once told me, Don, your humor is like a loaded pistol. In the hands of the wrong person, you can do a lot of damage. And that's humor is. Humor is a two-edged sword. The most effective humor you can use is self-effacing humor. And when I work with politicians, when I work with people who are worried about burnishing their brand, that's what we focus on, self-effacing humor. Everybody loves people who can laugh at themselves, everybody. And if you can get up, I'll give you an example that I had. One of my clients is Paul Mitchell, the big company around the world that does hair, and Jean-Paul DeJouro, and I have twice a year I have to go speak to them. And the first time I had to speak to him, we were at Newport Beach in this beautiful hotel, and everybody in Paul Mitchell, for whatever reason, I don't get it yet, dresses in black. They just dress in black. Everybody dresses in black. And I come in to give my 15-minute update on what's going on with their policies and things that are going on in Washington, D.C., where we attend to them. And just before I go up, the button on my suit pops. And so I'm now going to stand in front of all of these people who make a living making you look good. I mean, already you're intimidated about how your hair looks. Anytime you stand up in front of a Paul Mitchell group of people, you're thinking, oh my goodness, who did cut my hair last time? And I wonder how it's looking here. But the button popped. And so I had no button on my blazer. And I'm thinking, and it wasn't because I was too fat, by the way. It was just, it had come off, I'm afraid. So I get up there as I'm walking to the podium thinking I can't button, people are going to notice that this gold button's gone. They're going to think I'm either too poor to have a sport coat, or so I've got to somehow address this button. And so I started out by saying that I have this wonderful mother who prepared me for all the wisdom that I might ever need. She told me that the best wisdom about going on a date was found on the top of a mayonnaise bottle: keep cool but don't freeze. And they kind of giggled, and I said, and then she also told me that I should always dress myself up the best I can be, and when I walk out the door, forget about myself. And they kind of smiled and nodded. And I said, but she never taught me what to do when your button pops off your jacket just before you're supposed to speak to a room full of Paul Mitchell. And of course, then they howled and started to clap, and just something very simple, but I turned that weakness into an opportunity to connect at my own expense, rather than come in with some joke that didn't have anything to do with the real time of what was going on. So you're going to be able to find humor even in that moment that you're in. But if it's directed at you, that self-effacing humor is the safest humor you're going to be able to use. And all of a sudden I smile because I think of some of the other bits of humor that I've used with clients over the years, that maybe if that second or the third hour, if some of you want to, we can get really deep into the effective use of humor. But the proem, or the beginning of that speech, is to establish that connection with the audience, and then to introduce to the audience what you're going to talk about. This is like the lead in a newspaper article or a magazine article. So basically beginning with the summation, but it's a summation that you want to leave in a way that it creates expectation. You don't want to tell them the conclusions. You want to introduce them to the opportunities that they're going to have by being there for the next 10, 15, 20 minutes with you. Then you've got the middle of the speech. This is again going back to Aristotle's Taxis, as he breaks down communication and begin to show in a scientific way that we can all be effective communicators. We're not necessarily just born with the gift. But the second is the middle. And that's where you hit the three objectives. And I say three objectives because they're magical. Unless you're giving a lecture and you're going to test the students, and you've got what I call a command audience, they're commanded to be there, and they got to take notes, and they've got to regurgitate everything you tell them because it's going to be their grade at the end of the semester. I'd keep it to three things. That's what I would focus on. What are the three major points that I want to share with the group? What do I want them to remember? chances are they're not going to remember the 3 points, but they'll remember how you illustrate those 3 points and the anecdotes you use to illustrate those points, which will then help them recall what those 3 objectives were that you're sharing. In the objective, as you share that middle, keep in mind that a speech is very linear, unlike reading a book, where if you forget something, you can go back a page or two and say, oh yeah, now I remember what we're talking about here, or oh yes, I remember that character, or, oh yes, I remember that theory that he's now defending here 2 or 3 pages later. Speech, you can't do that. So what you want to do is you want to lay out that middle in such a way that you provide signposts for what's to come. As I have done here, again, not putting myself up as an example, but throughout our discussions so far in this first hour, I've talked about things that we're going to talk about going forward. So you've now had those expectations. You can see how the whole fits into what objectives we're trying to achieve here today. And then as you move through that middle, you want to be able to bridge from one subject to the next in a way that brings those 3 points together in a cohesive whole that your audience says, oh, that was rather satisfying. It's like a three act play. You're not going to jump from that first to the third act, or you're not going to go straight to the third act without setting up those first 2 acts. So allow those to build. And then there's the peroration, or the conclusion. The peroration is really a summation of what you have told them. Now, you know, you've heard the whole joke. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. It's a little more complex than that. There's the poetry to this. And so in the peroration, you want that summation to be compelling. You want it to have a sense of your emotion. You want it to appeal to both the head and the heart, particularly if you're going to end with a call to action, which I encourage you to do no matter what you're doing, because there's nothing more satisfying for an audience than to have a new ideal that they can pursue, or a new idea that they can pursue, or a new cause that they can get behind. Even if that emanates from the simple instruction you've given them. It could be as simple as, you know, much of what I've taught here today comes from Adam Grant's book, The Originals, or comes from Clayton Christensen's book on how to measure my life. I encourage all of you to read it. People go away thinking, oh, that's wonderful. I've got a little bit of an assignment. We close that nicely with something that I can go to pursue even further if I want to. So those are the 3 components, the taxis of a speech: your proem, your middle, and your peroration, your beginning, the middle, and the end. Any questions on that before we move forward? Any questions? Any experiences? Anybody remember a really great rousing close that they've heard? Nobody's ever really heard a really good speech? Anybody want to share a great speech they've heard? All right, well, we'll move on. The 4th part of that scientific structure of a speech is that it is a creative confluence of the content, which goes into those 3 areas, the length of the speech, and the style of the speech. The style is going to be influenced by your brand, the audience, and the subject matter. There are things that you're going to say in a talk about some personal experience. You've come back off an expedition. It's going to be much more anecdotal than if you're in delivering a scientific lecture or trying to persuade somebody on climate change, something like that. And so those are the 3 elements: the content, the length, and the style. Now, the length is a funny thing. The shorter the speech, the better, particularly if it's a persuasive speech. People remember much more readily the things you say in 3 or 4 or 5 minutes than they're going to in 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, you really are at a margin with an audience that can become a little frightening. Now, if it's a command audience, if you're instructing them, if you're a teacher, if you are a business leader, and you're laying out the objective for next year, then of course they're there, they're getting paid to be there, they're getting paid to bring their big boy and big girl pants and sit there and pay attention and be able to regurgitate what it is you're saying. But if you are doing an after dinner speech, if you are doing a breakfast speech, I would recommend you keep it to 20 minutes. And then if you feel there's more content, put it toward the end and welcome it in question and answers, because that can take on a life of its own when you get to the question and answer phase. So that's rule number 3. Just know the basic structure or taxis of the speech. Rule number 4, know the style of speech you want to give that's best suited to the occasion. And that's what Aristotle called lexis. And that's where we talk more specifically about the head issues and the heart issues. What do you think are head issues? When you hear these are head issues, these are analytical issues, what are head issues? Those accountants would have been much more appreciative of probably of head issues. Those are statistics.
Facts, like facts and
Exactly.
data. Yeah.
Exactly. It's data, facts, case studies, things that are concrete, things that I can then go and share. They're persuasive. And what are heart issues?
Personal stories.
Very good. Emotional appeals, personal stories, humor, anecdotes, and then also heart issues. After heart issues, head heart issues, and then mnemonics. Anybody know what mnemonics are?
Like memory techniques.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Memory techniques. Is that Julia? Is that who said that?
I think that was
That was Sarah. Sarah.
Sarah, share with us some of the memory techniques that you know of, or that you've used, or that you've seen used effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I operate in a health world, so there are definitely, let's say, patient interview components. Like you're interviewing an adolescent, you do heads, and so there are HEADS questions you want to hit when you interview an adolescent about their health. So just techniques for remembering content. That would be,
yeah, an acronym is a wonderful mnemonic. In a minute, we're going to talk about the heart theory of comedy. And that's a mnemonic. I remember every element of the heart theory of comedy because of the mnemonic. A funny joke, an anecdote, something somebody wants to share once they leave the meeting with you. That's a mnemonic. And then beyond that, head issues, heart issues, mnemonics in a speech, you've got the style and you've got the aesthetics of the speech. This is where I went wrong. On that day 4 years ago, I focused way too much on the style. I was so focused on the turn of phrase and the persuasiveness and the message between the lines and the poetry of the language. And not that I thought it was out of sorts, but it was just written to the wrong audience and it was delivered in the wrong way to the wrong audience. But it's the beauty of the triples, Veni, Vidi, Vici. We came, we saw, we conquered. Those are the things that people remember. That contributes to the style. Lincoln's, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. Again, the triple that comes out, that's the style. Then you got parallelisms. Anybody know what parallelisms are when it comes to speaking?
Bill, I'm thinking of drawing a comparison to something that's very familiar to them so that they can relate to the new concept being introduced with something that they will already track and understand very well.
Yep. Very good. It's something that will relate to them, obviously, that it's going to be easy for them to remember. Textually, it's something that flows in a parallel textual style. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That parallel text that, again, people are going to walk away saying, boy, that was a beautiful turn of a phrase on that. And then sentence variety. You know, as you speak, understand that when you get down into the meat of what it is you want to deliver, you can use a long sentence, but then follow it up with 2 or 3 short sentences. People like that, staccato. Think about the rhythm, the cadence of the language that you're using as well. Churchill was brilliant about this. Now, Churchill wrote everything down. Churchill used, the way Churchill wrote, by the way, he only wrote on half a side of a paper. So as he read it, he would read it as a column, not word for word, but he would have really thoughtfully internalized and memorized to the extent that all he needed was a paper there to give him some assurance. But, you know, never before in the course of human history has somebody done so many owed so much to so few. On the Battle of Britain, again, boom, 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 a really kind of staccato, and people come away with the chills. So think about the style, the word choice. Poetry is beautiful when it comes to heart issues. Startling statistics are very good when it comes to head issues, something that's going to grab attention, something that's going to call people to action. This is why you're hearing now on global climate change that by 2030 it's over. There's no turning back. I mean, that's a frightening proposition. We're going to talk about fear in a minute and how effective that is. In fact, fear is one of the most effective elements in public speaking. If you want somebody's attention, tell them your friendship's about to end. And boy, all of a sudden, well, what do you mean our friendship's about to end? Oh, by the way, if this doesn't change, you're going to be fired. What do you mean I'm going to get fired? I mean, all of a sudden you got their attention for whatever it's going to take. You can create that same thing in a large group of people by going in and beginning. It used to be that you never wanted to do that. 20, 30 years ago, you know, fear and it was called pandering, and you didn't go that way. But now, all you got to do is turn on the nightly news, and that's all there is now. And all political discourse starts from we're in an apocalyptic time, and if you don't vote for me, you know, it's over. Number 5 rule: take time to prepare, procrastinate, and hone your message. Anybody want to take on why you take time to prepare, procrastinate, and hone your message? This is something, again, all this is backed by science. Why would I put procrastinate in there?
Bill, what comes to mind there is that you've got to make sure that you are in sync with the current time. If you missed the morning headline or some critical point that's going to be just in the last moment before you are in front of the crowd, you could become irrelevant very quickly. So make sure you've left that moment to make sure you're current.
Excellent. Lloyd, let me tell you, Martin Luther King never planned on, I have a dream. He was up to 3 o'clock in the morning writing that speech. And he had all of his team around him, and they had procrastinated till 3 o'clock in the morning. And what was the early part of the speech? Anybody remember? The early part of the speech was really about fear. That the founders of this great nation had written a promissory note. Now, what's that all about? Well, the promissory note is that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that promissory note has not been cashed by a certain segment of our society. And it was beautiful, extremely eloquent, extremely well-reasoned, both head and heart in perfect balance, but nobody remembers that. But as he stood up to go speak, Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer who was sitting a few rows behind him, said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And evidently, Martin Luther King had shared with Mahalia Jackson and another group of people in an earlier speech about a dream he had about how he saw a time when his son and daughter would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And where white children and black children would join their hands. And so it was Mahalia Jackson who reminded Martin Luther King. Now, the procrastination that Martin Luther King had engaged in going up to that time had kept him open to creativity. He hadn't locked down. I locked down that unforgettable morning at the Montage. I locked down. I wasn't open for inspiration. I figured that every word had to be delivered as I had struck it because I was so in love with that prose. Martin Luther King understood that inspiration is going to strike. He was a minister. He understood how to deliver a sermon. He understood how to follow the Spirit, as he would say. He understood that the head and heart are going to combine, and there's going to be magic, and there will be magic. You've got to leave yourself open for that. So prepare, but as part of that preparation, procrastinate. As Lloyd said, keep yourself open to changes. I once wrote a speech for a very prominent politician who had to speak in Pittsburgh. And it was one of the most dull, stultifying topics that you could ever imagine. And so I needed something that would allow that politician to catch the attention of the people in Pittsburgh. And I labored over it and labored over it. The day of the speech came, and everything was there in terms of the content, but I didn't have that moment of connection. And I picked up the paper in Pittsburgh, and it talked about how the front page, #1 issue in Pittsburgh was that the air conditioners on the auto buses weren't working. Something had happened, computer, the technology, but all of a sudden the air conditioners were out on the buses and had been for 3 or 4 days, and heads were going to roll, and it was a disaster. And so I led up with this very important, today we're going to talk about this, 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 and this, international policy issues. But most importantly, is how we can get those damn air conditioners working on your buses. And the place busted up. I mean, all of a sudden that connection was made. The politician was comfortable. The audience was comfortable with the politician. And the politician is really complimented by saying, hey, guess what? I know what your problems are. I'm going to be sitting here talking about ethereal issues over in the Middle East that you may not have anything to do about. But I want you to know, I also understand your buses don't have air conditioners right now. And that's got to be something we got to look at as well. So procrastinate a little bit. Don't ever lock down when you prepare your speech to where you think I've got it. Some of the most beautiful magic happens just moments before you stand and deliver. As you do prepare the speech, though, the body of the speech, you want to hone your message. Again, we've talked a little bit about time. 20 minutes is ideal. So make what you want to say as concise as you can make it. And if you go beyond what you've prepared for, it's okay if you are getting into an anecdote or two. So if the speech slips out of 20 minutes, don't worry about that. You're not going to be in trouble, particularly if you've got an anecdote. But make sure that when you tell that anecdote, you are still mindful of the clock, because sometimes when people slip into a story, they can go the story for 20 minutes in and of itself and then never get back to the points that they want to make. I want to tell you a little bit about Allison Wood Brooks, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. She asked her students to deliver a persuasive speech for 2 minutes. That's where this comes from. You've got 2 minutes. She did it spontaneously. They hadn't come to class prepared to give the speech. She wanted to do a study on how they were going to react and scientifically, what qualities the best performers would have. And so as she gave that, of course, only 20% of us not being shy, by the way, they were going to be filmed And she had people, the students had never met before, who were going to go in and they were going to grade their speeches. The students were terrified, literally terrified, visibly shaken. In fact, a couple of them even burst into tears. And then she asked the students what the best counsel would be to them to try to have them deal with the terror. And they said, well, I guess just calm down. And she said, that's good counsel, calm down. In fact, in later studies, she asked 300 professionals, what advice would you give somebody who had just gotten an assignment to give a 2-minute speech? And they were terrified to give that speech. And the vast majority of those 300 professionals said, just tell them to calm down. Well, that's probably the worst advice you can give them, is to tell them to relax and calm down. Although it's the most popular recommendation. So what she did is she divided the students before they gave their speeches into 2 groups. And she took them into breakout rooms before they started to prepare their speech. And to the first group, she said, I want you to repeat 3 words. I am calm. I'm going to calm down and give my speech. And to the other group, she took them into the room as they prepared their 2-minute speech. And she said, I want you to keep 3 words in mind. I am excited. Well, what do you think happened? Julia, you want to say? I can see.
Yeah, I think you kind of set a new stage, and you, by thinking of it as excitement, you're able to kind of reallocate those feelings of nervousness and use them as a tool, actually, use them for enthusiasm, and focus on that instead of being afraid.
Exactly. When you channel that fear into excitement, a little bit of fear is good. Fear can sharpen the edge. But if we can channel that to excitement, move it from fear over to excitement, where preparation meets that opportunity to speak, which meets kind of the chemistry of the moment and the nerves. Again, magic can happen. Of those who came in to rate the speeches, those who were told to repeat, I am excited, as their mantra, rather than I am calm, were 17% more effective. And they were 20% more confident than those who were just going from the I am calm, I am relaxed. So to have a little bit of that edge when you are preparing that speech, when you're getting ready to deliver that speech, is a good thing. Then to take that, when you stand to deliver, to take those 3 or 4 items that you've written down, particularly if it's a 2-minute speech, you only have 2 minutes. So what are the 3 points I want to make? I'm assuming I know who my audience is now. I now know the 3 points I want to make. I now know the story that ties into maybe the statistics, so I'm hitting both head and heart. And I know what my call to action is as we come out of this. I'm going to talk about social justice. I'm going to talk about my faith. I'm going to talk about whatever it is that you're going to do. Then you come out of that speech, you go into that speech, then you want to be in the moment. And I don't know if any of you have ever studied any Zen Buddhism and what it means to be in the moment. But at that point, you want to not worry about the future. You don't want to worry about the past. In the hundreds of speeches, dozens, over 100 speeches I've given since that disaster 4 years ago, I've never once thought about that disaster as I'm getting up to speak. I've learned from it. I use it, but I don't think about it. When you get up to speak, you want to be in the moment. Has anybody ever heard of the concept of flow? Anybody, a runner, an athlete, figure skater? There's a term that is really an envious, precious moment that can be achieved, and it can be achieved by anybody. It's called flow. And it's introduced to us by, I can't even pronounce his last name, and I've tried and tried. It's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He's a Hungarian American he was the director of the psychology department at the University of Chicago. And flow is his concept. And flow is that moment, as I describe it, you're probably going to be enlightened to say, oh, I know all about flow. I remember I had that one experience when I was skiing and I was listening to my iPod. And all of a sudden, it was like I was floating. I didn't even feel the skis connect to the snow anymore. I wasn't worried about the cold. Everything was, I was caught up in that moment. This was what Zen Buddhist monks try to achieve, to get so into that moment of their breath and their state of being that thoughts of ego, future, past just melt away. And as you prepare for an important speech or communication event, you want to focus on flow in two areas. One is you prepare, and two, when you speak. And you think, well, wait, how do you get into flow when you're preparing? Have any of you ever been so absorbed in a book or so caught up in studying a subject that you lost track of time? If you have, then you've experienced flow. You're doing something you truly love to do. And this is of interest to you. I mean, obviously you like the idea of communications because we're having this wonderful couple of hours today to talk about it. You can have that same excitement, that same spirit of engagement, that same flow, that intrinsic connection that's been made, that full immersion. And sometimes when things are right, you can see that members of your audience, these friends that Julia was talking about earlier, you can connect with them and you can see they're caught up in that flow as well. And it's a magical experience, and you leave and you think, wow, that speech is over before it started. That lecture finished before I began it. I was able to write that chapter before I even typed the first note, the first key on the keyboard. There are moments like that that can be ours if we allow ourselves to come down. And my secret to that I learned early on as a young speechwriter, I was 24 when I went to work for President Reagan. And I learned early on that, and I learned by really experience, nobody really taught it to me. But number one, as many of you know, writing is a very lonely profession. That's why writers are either chain smokers or alcoholics, because that's how they pass the time. And but I think very successful writers can capture flow. And the way I would capture it is when I wrote, I would actually see the audience in my mind. And I've written novels. And people say, well, when you write a novel, how do you do that? Well, I do the same thing. I watch the story unfold as if it was a movie. And to do that, you can't have CNN on the background. You can't have, now, fortunately, I started out as a journalist, and so I can find flow in the middle of a tornado. A newsroom is horrendously busy. What you can't find flow is when you have a son or a daughter saying, Daddy, or Mommy, can you come? Or did you look what I drew here? The minute somebody takes you out, in fact, I've got the most incredible wife in the whole world, because she understands the concept of flow. And she can actually look at me when she comes into my office, and she can see from the expression on my face if I'm connected in that moment, and to come back later to tell me what it is that maybe she needed to talk to me about. I've been able to have all my children, now grandchildren, around me when I write, as long as nobody talks to me. But you can't have that moment when people pull you out. It's almost a jarring experience, and it'll take you 3 or 4 minutes to get back into flow. That same concept can be had when you stand to speak. Again, if you don't allow yourself to get distracted and you focus on the allies and the assets. Now, how is flow achieved? Again, a very scientific way of doing this. And that is when your expertise, high level of expertise in a given area, meets a high level of challenge in a given area. If you've got a high level of expertise, but the challenge is not commensurate with your level of expertise, you're bored. So last thing you want to do is, oh, this is another memo I got to write or another report I got to do about something because it's part of the bureaucratic nightmare that is my job. But whether you're a salesperson, a professor, a writer, a physician, when you have that moment of your level of expertise meeting the level of challenge that's commensurate, that's where the magic takes place. And you can establish that with the audience. Any questions on flow? I love the concept of flow. And if you want to stay, again, we're going to finish here in about 14 minutes. If you want to stay, we can talk about that a little more deeply. But we'll get through these last parts of the taking time to prepare and procrastinating. When you prepare, I've talked about the importance of being concise. You want to determine the appropriate audio-visual, the appropriateness of audio-visual, and we are PowerPointed to death. That's why I didn't give you anything. There's nothing here except a conversation that I've wanted to have with you. I've looked forward to this. I hope you've heard the enthusiasm because I love talking about what we're talking about. There's nothing more. I mean, good communications heals anything, heals relationships, heals our depression, heals. I mean, communication is the most effective tool that we have in our arsenal as humans, I believe. And I love to talk about every chance I get. Don't contaminate it with audio visuals unless you really need audio visuals. If you got to get some sales figures over to people who work for you, that's fine. It might be an appropriate time. But death by PowerPoint is what it's called in the Pentagon. Plan what you're going to wear the evening before. Get rid of the mechanical things that you don't want to have to worry about the day of. When you dress for the occasion, you want to dress at or slightly above what you expect the audience is going to be wearing. Or you want to dress according to your brand. If I am a physician and I'm coming in to talk to an audience about a latest therapy or something, I may want to have my lab coat. It may be wholly appropriate for me to be in a lab coat. If I'm Steve Jobs, I've got my brand. Some people in the audience may be in their suit and ties, but they understand that part of my creativity and my message is the fact that I am not distracted by anything when it comes to my sartorial splendor. It's black mock turtleneck, white shoes and white tennis shoes and Levi's. But take care of that beforehand so you're not worried about it. Make sure you know the venue. I mean, if you have a chance, see what the room looks like where you're going to be speaking. Envision the audience, where they're going to be sitting. Make sure you know that you're there and you get there on time and you get there early enough. You may want to stay out of sight. You know, you don't want to look like you're overeager and have people mill about and be uncomfortable approaching you and you be uncomfortable. If it's a small audience, though, perhaps you want to get there and you want to shake hands before you get up so you can actually ask what they're thinking about, what their concerns might be, and you can address and connect with them that way. Prepare and distribute study materials. Again, we've got plenty of study materials I'll inundate you all with, but not until this is over because, again, you don't want to lose that eye contact and the ability to have that karma moment with your audience. You don't want them to be going through the materials thinking, well, I can get it out of here and don't have to listen to all of this. And then I think the most succinct counsel, one of the greatest writers, I believe, in the English language has been George Orwell. I think 1984 is probably the most important novel we can all be reading right now, that and Animal Farm. But George Orwell's, he's got 5 rules for effective communication. And I want to read those to you. Again, all this will be in the notes. Never use a long word when a short one will do. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. Never use a passive when you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word or jargon word, if you can think of an English equivalent. And break any of these rules sooner than say anything barbarous. So if you got to break those rules, they're to be broken. But just be concise, simple language, always try to speak in the active. Sometimes it's important to go to the passive voice, and you know what that is. But when I work with young writers, I particularly try to hammer on that. Nothing is as beautiful and easy to understand as the active voice. Rule number 6, know who you are and be likable. Bring something personal to the communication process. We've talked about only 7% of your message is going to be communicated by the spoken word. 93% of the message is going to be dependent on your quality of delivery, which is going to be a confluence of your body language and your vocal use, your tone, your pitch, your inflections, your cadence. And so be mindful. People will go away. They might say, well, I don't really remember everything she said, but boy, was that magical what she said. I mean, there's something that does capture them. They're going to remember the overall feeling. They're going to remember the overall message. They may not remember the actual anecdotes or the statistics, but they're going to remember because you presented with that confidence and you were able to hit those nonverbal cues that are important. Keep in mind, I think we talked about this, that you're on stage the minute you walk into the forum and people look at you. Now you're really on stage the minute they go to your Facebook page or the minute they go to your Twitter account and size you up and determine where you stand on whatever it is you stand on and whether they agree with you or not. But in all of that, as you build that impression they're going to have, ask yourself what your alpha story is. Again, this goes back to your brand. Who are you? What is it that you have to offer? What is the hobby that you can bring to bear on whatever it is? And anything you can, I mean, anything can make a connection. That's where genius is created. When you take work that's been done by somebody else, let's say remediation of the coronavirus, and my perspective as a homemaker, that's a great talk. As a homemaker, how do I protect my family and remediate against the coronavirus? I mean, that's simple. As a student, as an 8th grader, how would I advise my friends to protect themselves from the coronavirus? Great talk. So you can bring those elements together. So your alpha story, who you are, what you stand for, what you believe, can come into play with what it is you want to share. That alpha story will also lead to what I call the likability quotient. How likable are you? People want, people are shy. They really want to root for you. They don't want to invest in you till they know that they're safe to invest in you emotionally, but they still want to root for you. And so they want to like you. And what qualities contribute to you being likable? Anybody have any thoughts? If you want to impress people and have them like you.
I just, on my morning walk this morning, I was listening to Brene Brown's Dare Greatly.
Yeah,
and
really.
she talked about vulnerability. And she told a story about sitting with her husband watching some Ellen show, and Ellen was dancing like crazy and doing all these goofy things, and she leaned over to her husband and said, "Don't you just love her? She is so bold, being so brave, being so silly or goofy or whatever, and we love that in other people, but we're so afraid to do it ourselves. But yet we see that vulnerability and we love vulnerability. We just think that when we do it, it's weakness, right? And so that, I think, is a connection. It makes people just immediately like you."
Yes, exactly. And she's established her brand on that a little bit. Brene talks about that.
Yep.
How that is Ellen. If I remember that story, I think I read that book a while ago, but her husband didn't quite understand it. He thought it was a little bit goofy, and she had to explain that this is who Ellen is. And people love that optimism. That is the number one quality of likability, by the way, is optimism. If you are optimistic, now you don't want to be so sunny that you blind people, but you want to be optimistic. You want to be able, people want to know that in difficult situations they can count on you and that you might know how to get them safely to the exit if there's trouble. The second thing that people want to know for likability is that you care about them. Again, going back to that, if there's nothing here, there's nothing here. People want to know that you care about them, that you're able, again, to help them embrace the opportunities that are important to them. People like to know you're able to handle stress. I did that poorly 4 years ago. I wasn't handling the stress very well. I really should have stopped and redirected the things I was talking about. The fifth or sixth on the likability factor, they actually have rated these scientifically, is your ability to laugh at yourself. So we go back to what we talked about a minute ago, the self-effacing humor, and be able to laugh and kind of take the tension out at your own expense. And the final in the likability is your ability to perform in a crisis and to be humble in your success. In other words, we get each other through whatever it is, the dilemma that we're in, and we come out the other side, and I don't talk about it anymore. We got through the process, and now we're on, and by the way, let's redirect and go back to what's concerning you now, and let's make sure we take care of that. One of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed, and he's been a real mentor, again, that's why I keep the wristwatch, Li Kai-shing, he was honored by Jacques Chirac with the Légion d'honneur in France. And he asked me to come over to that ceremony when he accepted that award from the president of France. It was the night I was supposed to be at the second inauguration of George Bush and with my wife, but a client called, so my oldest son took my wife to the inauguration that night. But I went to France. We went to the Élysée Palace. And as we were ready to leave, come out in the waiting room, Mr. Lee went to the door, and the thought was, obviously he's the honor, he's going in. He held the door open for everybody. He was the last person to go in. Again, the needs of everybody else comes first. And I could regale you with stories of what this man has done, even with the kind of untold wealth he has, but he's never forgotten that other people come first. And so, again, get them through the door and then don't worry about it. The final thing is on likability, just in your speech, do things that are interesting, be enthusiastic, and be concise. And then just a few parting thoughts. No matter what happens, no matter how bad I was at the montage 4 years ago, I promise you I was not as bad as I think I was. But just as we know that we're never as bad as we think we are, we're never as good as we think we are either. Somewhere between the spectrum, we're going to stand and deliver, and we're going to be successful in the process. And just to put that in context of how important it is, I want to read for you a review of a speech that makes the point. Here's the review. How dare he, then standing on their graves, misstate the cause for which they died, and libel the statesman who founded the government. Anybody know what that's a review of? It appeared in the Chicago Tribune. It was a review of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
So no matter who we are, no matter how we think we've performed, just understand that perhaps the greatest speech ever given, a speech that literally changed the course of the nation. If you go back and you look at what the great historian Gary Wills wrote about the Gettysburg Address, all men being created equal, it was Lincoln who talked about that promissory note first. It was not Martin Luther King. Lincoln understood that there was a deep hole in the fabric of America, that all men were not being treated equal. And he stood and delivered, and literally in that 216 words changed the context of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, opening up that now to be all-inclusive. In the end, the final rule, just be comfortable and have fun. And if you need anything, I'm here. I'll give you my, I'll email each of you with the information that we have to provide you, and you'll have my contact information, and I'm always available. So with that, I say thank you, and those who need to go can go, and those who would like to stay, I'm happy to just answer some personal questions. If you've got speeches coming up, you need any help, if you want to go a little deeper into some of the meat we've talked about, I'm happy to take some time and do that now. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Bill, so much. And thank you, everybody who joined us today. We'll send a follow-up email. And anybody who wants to stay on with Bill, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you.